What happens when Britain's most controversial royal sits down with television's most unfiltered host? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry faces off against Macy faces off against Sharon Osbourne in what began as a seemingly cordial interview, but quickly descended into one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Harry walked onto the view set. But nobody could have predicted the nuclear meltdown that was about to occur. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be a platform for Prince Harry to discuss his latest charitable endeavors and upcoming projects. The producers had briefed the panel that this would be a straightforward conversation about his work with veterans and mental health advocacy. What they got instead was a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral completely out of control when Sharon Osbourne decides she's had enough of what she perceives as royal hypocrisy. The atmosphere backstage was already charged before filming began. Sources close to the production revealed that Harry's team had submitted an extensive list of topics that were considered off-limits, including any discussion of his father, King Charles, his stepmother, Queen Camilla, or the ongoing rift with his brother, Prince William. They had also specifically requested that there be no mention of the Netflix documentary series or the Talal memoir that had caused such controversy. Sharon, however, had other plans entirely. As Harry settled into his seat, adjusting his tie, with what appeared to be nervous energy, Sharon's eyes never left him. Her co-hosts exchanged subtle glances, sensing the electricity in the air. The show's opening segment preceded normally pleasantries exchanged, Harry discussing his foundation's work with wounded veterans. His responses were measured, diplomatic, and carefully crafted, exactly what his media training had prepared him for. But Sharon was watching, waiting, and calculating her next move with the precision of a seasoned predator. "It's wonderful to hear about your charity work, Harry," Sharon began, her voice deceptively sweet as she leaned forward in her chair. "Really admirable. But I have to ask, and I think our viewers deserve to know, how do you reconcile this public image of caring for veterans with what many see as your complete abandonment of your own military family back home?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Harry's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation before he regained his composure. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that Sharon had just crossed the line that Harry's team had so carefully drawn. But this was exactly what Sharon had been planning from the moment she learned about the interview. "I think that's quite an unfair characterization, Sharon," Harry replied, his British accent becoming more pronounced as his stress levels rose. "My commitment to veterans has never wavered, regardless of geographical boundaries or family circumstances." Sharon's laugh was sharp and cutting. Geographical boundaries, family circumstances. That's quite the euphemism for turning your back on everything you once stood for, isn't it? She shuffled through her notes with theatrical precision, as if she had been preparing for this moment for months. "Let me refresh your memory about some of those family circumstances you're so casually dismissing." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Camera operators zoomed in on Harry's face, capturing every micro-expression as Sharon continued her relentless assault. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, now gripped them with white-knuckled intensity. "You served your country with honor for 10 years, Sharon continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train building speed. "You worked alongside brave men and women who bled for the crown you've now decided to trash at every opportunity. These people looked up to you, respected you, followed you into battle. And now you're sitting here in a Hollywood studio cashing checks from Netflix while throwing those same institutions under the bus." Harry's media training was being put to the ultimate test. Every instinct told him to fight back, to defend himself against accusations that cut to the very core of his identity. But he also knew that losing his temper on live television would only prove Sharon's point and provide her with exactly the kind of content she was clearly fishing for. "My service record speaks for itself," Harry said, his voice steady but with an underlying current of barely controlled anger. "I've never forgotten my brothers and sisters in arms, and I never will. What I have done is chosen to speak truth, to power something that apparently makes people very uncomfortable." Sharon pounced on this opening like a cat on a wounded bird. "Truth to power, is that what we're calling it now?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she turned to face the audience, as if inviting them to witness this moment of royal delusion. "Let me tell you about truth, Harry. The truth is that you had everything, absolutely everything, handed to you on a silver platter. And you threw it all away because you couldn't handle a little criticism from the British press." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Harry's composure finally began to crack, and for the first time since the interview began, genuine emotion flickered across his features. His breathing became slightly more shallow, and a muscle in his cheek began to twitch almost imperceptibly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Harry said, his diplomatic mask finally beginning to slip. "You have no understanding of what my family went through, what my wife endured, or the impossible position we were put in by an institution that cares more about protecting its image than protecting the people who serve it." Sharon's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone who had just landed a perfect blow. She had successfully goaded Harry into abandoning his carefully rehearsed talking points and was now speaking from a place of raw emotion, exactly where she wanted him. "Your wife," Sharon repeated, her eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Oh, you mean the woman who married into the most privileged family on earth and then spent the next few years complaining about how difficult her life was? The same woman who claimed the royal family was racist while conveniently forgetting to mention any specific names or incidents that could actually be verified." The studio fell into a deadly silence. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harry's face had gone completely rigid, and his eyes had taken on a dangerous glint that suggested Sharon had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. But Sharon wasn't finished. She had tasted blood in the water, and like any seasoned television predator, she was prepared to go in for the kill regardless of the consequences that might follow. "Let's talk about privilege for a moment, shall we?" Sharon continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her decades in the entertainment industry. "Because I think our viewers need to understand exactly what kind of privilege we're dealing with here. You were born into a life that billions of people could only dream of: private jets, luxury homes, security details, the finest education money can buy. And yet somehow, you've managed to paint yourself as the victim in this story." Harry's hands had now formed fists on the armrests of his chair, and his breathing had become noticeably more labored. The other host sat in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing something that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Even the studio audience, usually vocal and reactive, had fallen into an almost religious silence as they watched this royal meltdown unfold in real time. Victim Ye's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the emotional toll Sharon's relentless assault was taking on him. "You think this is about playing the victim? This is about protecting my family from the same machine that killed my mother. This is about refusing to let history repeat itself while people like you sit in your ivory towers and judge situations you couldn't possibly understand." The mention of Princess Diana sent a visible shockwave through the studio. Sharon's expression shifted momentarily, as if she recognized that Harry had just raised the stakes to a level that could have serious consequences. But instead of Backing down, she doubled down with the ruthlessness that had made her both famous and infamous throughout her career. "Don't you dare," Sharon said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. "Don't you dare invoke your mother's memory to justify your betrayal of everything she believed in. Diana may have had her issues with the royal family, but she never abandoned her duty. She never ran away to California to make Netflix documentaries and write tell-all books for profit." Harry shot to his feet so quickly that his chair nearly toppled backward. The sudden movement sent a ripple of shock through the studio, and security personnel could be seen tensing in the background, unsure whether they were witnessing a dramatic gesture or the prelude to something more serious. "How dare you speak about my mother?" Harry shouted, his voice echoing through the studio with a raw intensity that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. "You didn't know her. You don't know what she went through, what she sacrificed, or what she would have wanted for her sons." Sharon remained seated, her expression calm and calculating despite the storm she had unleashed. She had achieved exactly what she had set out to do. She had broken through Harry's carefully constructed public persona and exposed the raw, unfiltered emotion beneath. And she wasn't done yet. "I know she wouldn't have wanted her son to become a professional victim," Sharon replied coolly, her voice cutting through Harry's emotional outburst like a blade through silk. "I know she wouldn't have wanted you to abandon your responsibilities and air your family's private business to the highest bidder. And I certainly know she wouldn't have wanted you to use her memory as a shield every time someone calls you out on your choices." The words hit Harry like physical blows. His face cycled through a range of emotions: rage, hurt, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to despair. The cameras captured every moment of his psychological unraveling, creating television gold that would be replayed endlessly across social media and news networks. "You're crossing a line here," Sharon, one of the other hosts, finally interjected, her voice shaky with the recognition that the show had spiraled completely beyond their control. "Maybe we should take a commercial break." "No." Sharon cut her off without even looking in her direction, her eyes never leaving Harry's face. "I think our viewers deserve to hear the truth for once, instead of the carefully sanitized version of events that Harry's public relations team usually serves up. They deserve to know what kind of man abandons his family, his country, and his duty because things got a little difficult." Harry's composure finally shattered completely. The diplomatic training, the media coaching, the careful image management, all of it evaporated in an instant as years of pent-up frustration and rage exploded to the surface. "Difficult?" Harry screamed, his voice breaking with emotion. "You call watching my wife being systematically destroyed by the British press difficult? You call having my newborn son's security threatened difficult? You call being told that my mixed-race children wouldn't be entitled to the same protections as other royal grandchildren difficult?" The revelation hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Even Sharon seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw pain and fury in Harry's voice. But the damage was done both to Harry's carefully maintained public image and to any possibility that this interview could be salvaged. "So, now we're playing the race card," Sharon said, her voice carrying a tone of weary disappointment, as if Harry had just confirmed her worst suspicions about him. How predictable. When all else fails, when you can't defend your actions on their own merits, you fall back on accusations of racism. It's the oldest trick in the victim playbook. The accusation hit Harry like a slap across the face. His eyes widened with a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process that Sharon had just dismissed his family's experiences with such casual cruelty. The studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. "You're unbelievable," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying more venom than any shout. You're absolutely unbelievable. You sit there in your position of privilege, having never experienced a day of the scrutiny or pressure that my family has endured. And you have the audacity to dismiss our experiences as playing cards. Sharon leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had just achieved exactly what they had set out to accomplish. She had successfully goaded Harry into revealing more than he had ever intended, had stripped away his diplomatic facade, and had created a moment of television that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. "I'm stating facts," Sharon replied, her voice maddeningly calm in contrast to Harry's obvious emotional distress. "The fact is that you had everything and threw it away. The fact is that instead of working within the system to create change, you chose to burn it all down and profit from the ashes. And the fact is that you're now sitting here trying to justify those choices by painting yourself and your family as victims of circumstances that millions of people would consider blessings." Harry stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving with barely controlled rage, his hands trembling with the effort of restraining himself from saying or doing something that would make an already catastrophic situation even worse. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of his internal struggle, every flicker of emotion that crossed his features. But Sharon had one more weapon in her arsenal, one final blow that would push this confrontation beyond the point of no return and into territory that would have consequences far beyond the confines of this television studio. "You know what I find most disturbing about all of this, Harry?" Sharon said, her voice taking on a tone of mock concern that was somehow more devastating than any direct attack could have been. "It's not just that you've abandoned your family and your country. It's that you've weaponized your own trauma, commodified your pain, and turned your mother's death into a brand. You've built an entire industry around being Princess Diana's grieving son. And frankly, it's grotesque." The words struck Harry like lightning. His face went completely pale, then flushed red with a rage so intense that several people in the studio visibly flinched. The accusation was so brutal, so precisely calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage, that even Sharon's co-hosts looked stunned by the cruelty of it. "Stop," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a warning that made everyone in the studio understand. They were witnessing something dangerous. "Just stop talking." But Sharon had come too far to stop now. She had spent her entire career building up a reputation for fearlessness, for saying what others wouldn't dare to say. And she wasn't about to back down when she was this close to creating the kind of television moment that would define her legacy. Diana's death was a tragedy that touched the entire world, Sharon continued, her voice growing stronger as she delivered what she clearly intended to be the killing blow. "But you've turned that tragedy into your meal ticket. Every interview, every documentary, every book deal, it all comes back to your mother's death and how it affected poor little Tom. Harry, you've made millions of dollars off her memory, and you have the nerve to lecture others about exploitation." The studio erupted into chaos. Harry's security detail moved closer, sensing that their client was approaching a breaking point that could have serious consequences. The other hosts began talking simultaneously, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had spiraled so far beyond their ability to manage that they might as well have been trying to stop a hurricane with their bare hands. "You're sick," Harry said, his voice shaking with an emotion so raw and primal that it seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "You're genuinely sick to sit there and accuse me of profiting from my mother's death. A woman who died when I was 12 years old, who I never got to know as an adult, who never got to meet her grandchildren. That's beyond disgusting. It's inhuman." Tears were now streaming down Harry's face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage, the kind that come when someone has been pushed so far beyond their breaking point that their body doesn't know how else to process the overwhelming flood of emotion. I'm stating facts. Sharon replied, seemingly unmoved by the display of raw emotion she had provoked. Every major decision you've made since leaving the royal family has been marketed around your mother's story. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, the memoir, they all center on Diana's death and how it shaped your trauma. You've built a multi-million-dollar empire on the foundation of that tragedy. Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and when he looked up, his expression had changed completely. The hurt and vulnerability had been replaced by something cold and calculating, a look that suggested he had just made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "You want to know about my mother?" Harry said, his voice now steady and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than his earlier outburst. "Let me tell you about my mother. She spent the last years of her life being hunted by photographers who cared more about getting the perfect shot than they did about her humanity. She died in a tunnel in Paris because she was being chased by people who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited." He stepped closer to Sharon. Close enough that the cameras had to adjust to keep both of them in frame. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But every word carried the weight of decades of pain and anger. "And now, I'm sitting across from someone who's doing exactly the same thing. You're exploiting tragedy for ratings. You're turning human suffering into entertainment. You're everything that was wrong with the system that killed her, and you don't even have the self-awareness to recognize it." For the first time since the interview began, Sharon looked genuinely unsettled. Perhaps she had finally realized that she had pushed too far, that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it was too late for regrets or second thoughts. "The difference," Harry continued, his voice gaining strength with every word, "is that when I share my story, I'm trying to prevent other people from going through what my family went through. When you exploit it, you're just feeding the same machine that destroyed her in the first place." Sharon opened her mouth to respond, but Harry cut her off with a gesture that was both dismissive and final. "I'm done," he said, pulling off his microphone and dropping it onto his chair. "I'm done with this conversation. I'm done with this show. And I'm done with people like you who think that basic human decency is optional as long as it gets you good ratings." He turned to walk away, but then stopped and looked back at Sharon one final time. His expression was no longer angry or hurt. It was simply tired, as if the confrontation had drained him of all emotion except disappointment. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Sharon?" he said. "It's that you had an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about real issues that matter to real people. You could have used your platform to talk about veterans' mental health or the importance of supporting military families, or any number of topics that might have actually made a difference in someone's life. Instead, you chose to turn it into a circus for your own amusement." Sharon finally found her voice, but it was too late. "Harry, wait. No," he said firmly. "I've waited long enough. I've spent my entire adult life waiting for people like you to remember that there are actual human beings behind the headlines. I'm done waiting." With that, Prince Harry walked off the set of The View, leaving behind a studio full of stunned silence and a host who had gotten exactly what she wanted: viral content that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. But at a cost that was only beginning to become clear. The cameras continued to roll as Sharon sat alone at the desk, her co-hosts having followed Harry off the set in an attempt to salvage what remained of the situation. For the first time in her career, Sharon Osbourne appeared to be at a complete loss for words. She had won the battle, successfully goading Harry into the kind of emotional breakdown that would generate millions of views and endless commentary. But as she sat there in the aftermath of her victory, staring at the empty chair where Harry had been sitting just moments before, it was impossible to ignore the question of whether some victories came at too high a price. The interview was over, but the consequences were just beginning. In the space of 30 minutes, Sharon had managed to create one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history. But she had also revealed something about herself that would be impossible to take back. She had shown the world exactly how far she was willing to go for the sake of entertainment, and that revelation would follow her for the rest of her career as the studio lights dimmed and the crew began to pack up their equipment. One thing was certain: this was a confrontation that would be remembered, analyzed, and debated for years to come. Sharon Osbourne had destroyed Prince Harry on live television, but in doing so, she had also destroyed something in herself that could never be rebuilt.